Evening, friends. I'm Beau LeClaire, and this here's the Dixie Tales, where the Deep South still whispers if you listen close. These are the stories that never made the history books, but live on in the heat, the dust, and the hush between crickets. So pull up a chair, tap that like, and subscribe if you believe some truths are too wild to stay buried. Where are you listening from tonight? There's a certain hour in New Orleans when the city feels older than the country it belongs to. When the sunlight sinks low between the balconies, and the lamps haven't quite decided whether to burn steady or flicker against the oncoming dark. That hour carries a quiet weight, a heaviness in the air the locals understand without needing a word for it. It's the breath before night wakes the French Quarter back up. Walk those narrow streets at dusk, and the past rises like steam off the stones. You can smell it in the damp brick walls, in the faint sweetness of jasmine drifting from hidden courtyards, in the way the river wind moves slow and deliberate, as if it remembers too much. The French Quarter never truly forgets anything. Not old sins, not old saints, and certainly not the beginnings of the rituals that still shape the city. That's the thing about Mardi Gras. People think they know what it is. They think of the parades and beads, the bright masks and brass bands, the wild laughter rolling down Bourbon Street like a second tide. But the truth of it, the old truth, the buried truth, doesn't sit on the surface with the noise. It hides in the foundation, in the Creole bones of the quarter, in the shadows of churches, and the whispers of old societies whose names barely survived the ink they were written in. In that fading light, the French Quarter shows you the pieces most folks miss. The iron balconies sagging under ferns that have lived longer than some families. The cracked plaster walls where Spanish and French hands built, rebuilt, and built again after fire and hurricane tried to rewrite everything. The lanterns casting thin halos against the old bricks. The smell of chicory drifting out of a cafe where generations have warmed their hands on bitter coffee before heading into church, or trouble, or both. That's the New Orleans where Mardi Gras was born, not the neon one, not the one sold on postcards, but the one stitched together by sailors, slaves, soldiers, smugglers, priests, and women whose names never made the ledgers but shaped the culture just the same. Listen close as the quarter settles into its twilight hum. Somewhere, a distant trumpet warms up, muffled and wandering. The notes sound swollen with memory, like the horn itself knows it's singing on sacred ground. A carriage wheel rattles across an uneven stone. A door creaks. Footsteps echo without revealing who they belong to. New Orleans is a city that likes to introduce itself through sound before sight. And in that sound, there's a rhythm older than the parades, older than the floats, older even than the krewes that parade through the streets each carnival season. It's the rhythm of survival wrapped in celebration, the rhythm of a city trying to carve out identity in the face of empire, church, and hunger. A rhythm born from Catholic ritual, African ceremony, French indulgence, and Creole resilience. That mix is where Mardi Gras really began, not with a parade schedule or a king cake recipe, but with a collision of cultures fighting to exist without losing themselves. Long before a float ever rolled down Street Charles Avenue, the people of New Orleans used carnival season to shed the weight the world put on them. Masks weren't decoration, they were escape, they were permission, they were rebellion dressed in color and feathers. The city learned early that there are truths too dangerous to speak behind a bare face, and too heavy to carry without help. A mask made it easier to tell them. In those early days, the French colonists used Mardi Gras to honor old country rituals, a kind of homesickness turned into tradition. But homesickness alone couldn't hold this place. New Orleans absorbed far more than the French meant to share. Africans brought in chains, carried their own ceremonies, their own spirits, their own ways of celebrating and mourning. Creoles of every shade added music, language, rhythm, and defiance. The Spanish tried to impose order. The church tried to impose guilt. Neither stuck. Not fully. Mardi Gras grew in the cracks where order failed. Picture the French Quarter of the 1700s, dirt streets, wooden homes, the constant threat of fire, the river gnawing at the edge of the settlement. Picture Catholics celebrating a feast day their priests could barely supervise. Africans gathering in Congo Square on Sundays with drums and dances that shook the very ground. Creoles blending languages and beliefs until neither the French nor the Spanish recognized what they heard. That collision, messy, loud, and alive, is where Mardi Gras found its heartbeat. The first parades weren't parades at all. They were rowdy gatherings the city leaders tried hard to outlaw. Carnival was forbidden more often than it was permitted. Too much drinking, too much mischief, too much freedom in a town that feared chaos more than sin. But the people celebrated anyway, which meant the city learned a lesson it never quite forgot. New Orleans doesn't obey rules during Carnival, it teaches them. Years later, long after the colonial days faded, long after the flags changed hands, New Orleans found itself facing a different problem. The Americans who took over didn't understand the Creole customs. They saw Mardi Gras as wildness needing a leash. The answer to that problem didn't come from the public squares or the mayor's office. It came from behind closed doors. Secret societies formed krewes operating under names whispered rather than spoken aloud. Men met in dim rooms lit by gas lamps, planning how to turn a celebration the authorities distrusted into something structured enough to survive. They weren't saints. They weren't villains. They were the guardians of a tradition too precious to lose. They built the first organized parade. They created the symbols, the robes, the myths. They turned chaos into ceremony. Their masks weren't to hide mischief, they were shields against a world that feared cultural freedom. Every year after that, Mardi Gras grew, layer by layer, mask by mask, secret by secret. The truth remained hidden behind the spectacle, preserved, protected, alive. That's why the festival still holds a certain weight when the sun goes down. The quarter can look loud and reckless, but underneath the noise lies ceremony. Old rules, old rhythms, old memories. Mardi Gras isn't a party. It's a survival ritual, dressed in celebration. Walk the quarter at dusk during carnival season, and the shadows feel different, thicker, more watchful. The bells of St. Louis Cathedral ring across the square, calling the faithful to remember their sins even as the city prepares to forget its burdens. Behind the cathedral, in those narrow alleys where gas lamps flicker against cracked plaster, you can feel the beginnings of Mardi Gras like a pulse. Not loud, not bright, not wild, just steady. As old as the river, as stubborn as the people, as sacred as anything carried from one generation to the next. And that's where the truth behind Mardi Gras begins, not with celebration, but with a city, learning to wear masks long before the world asked it to. Long before New Orleans was a dream scratched on a map, long before the first paddle wheel churned the river mud, Carnival had already begun drifting toward these shores like a ghost carried on the tide. To understand how Mardi Gras took root here, a person has to step back, far back, into a time when France still claimed a wild, endless territory called La Louisiane, and every footstep in this land shook with uncertainty. The people who came to settle it brought their fears, their faith, and their rituals with them, and none of those rituals was more stubborn or more beloved than Carnival. The French colonists did not invent Mardi Gras. The celebration stretched back through centuries of European history, Catholic calendars, pagan feasts, medieval excesses, and village revelries that lit up the dark winters of the Old World. Carnival was the last burst of indulgence before Lent, a final permission to taste, drink, laugh, and sin before 40 days of austerity and prayer. In France, the peasants wore masks, the wealthy held masquerade balls, priests looked the other way, and entire towns surrendered to a kind of controlled chaos for a night. When the French crown sent explorers across the Atlantic, those traditions packed their bags too. And so, on a misty February day in 1699, the first recorded Mardi Gras in the New World began not in New Orleans, but along a lonely stretch of the Mississippi River. Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, a French-Canadian naval officer, had sailed into the Gulf with a band of men searching for the river's mouth. They fought storms, sickness, and the threat of hostile shorelines, driven by the dream of building a colony worthy of the French king's favor. On the evening of March 2nd, the eve of Mardi Gras, d'Iberville and his brother Bienville camped along the riverbank about 60 miles south of where New Orleans now stands. The land was swampy, alive with insects and the croaking of unfamiliar creatures. Cypress and willow trees bent over the water like old giants whispering secrets. The river itself moved slow and heavy as if it were sizing up the strangers who dared settle near it. The men gathered around their fire, cold, hungry, and weary from weeks of travel. Yet, as the sun dipped and the sky turned to deep purple, someone remembered the date. Mardi Gras Eve, a day meant for celebration, no matter how far from home the French had drifted. So they observed it, right there in the wilderness. A small fire, a shared drink, a prayer to steady the soul in an untamed land. D'Iberville marked the spot on his journal and christened it Point du Mardi Gras, forever tying the wild heart of the Mississippi to a centuries-old European ritual. The celebration was humble, almost fragile, but it was a seed. The first hints of carnival carried into the Louisiana air. But the truth is, that little moment in 1699 would have meant nothing if not for what came after. France wanted a colony, not a campsite. In 1718, they sent Bienville back with orders to found a permanent settlement. He chose a patch of high ground, not the safest, not the driest, but close to the river and open to the Gulf. He called it New Orleans, after Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, the regent of France. The colonists who arrived were not noblemen or scholars. They were soldiers, criminals, indentured workers, desperate peasants, and women sent against their will to populate the frontier. They brought their language, their songs, and yes, their carnival traditions, but they also brought fear. The swamps breathed too close. The summers burned like open furnaces. The winters were wet and mean. Hunger lurked at every turn. Fever carried people off in days. Those early settlers clung to carnival like a rope tied to home. It reminded them of who they were when the river tried to drown them and the wilderness swallowed men whole. During Mardi Gras, they could dress up, dance, and forget for one night that this new world wanted to break them. They feasted on what little they had: salt, pork, fish, bread baked in crude ovens. They drank rum strong enough to shake the bones. They sang French songs until their throats cracked. It didn't matter that the city was barely more than a few crooked streets then. Carnival anchored them to the lives they'd left behind. But Mardi Gras in those days looked nothing like the dazzling spectacle known today. It was a rough, rowdy thing, more tavern than parade, more mischief than marvel. Masking existed, but it was dangerous. A mask could hide a thief, or a lover escaping a jealous husband, or a runaway servant walking free for a night. The authorities feared it. They issued edicts banning masked celebrations, but the rules held about as well as sandbags in a storm. The people celebrated anyway. When a ritual becomes survival, no law can kill it. The French were not alone in shaping these early celebrations. New Orleans was a port city from the moment it was born. Ships arrived from the Caribbean carrying enslaved Africans whose cultures and beliefs had endured despite captivity. Even shackled, they brought with them ancient rhythms, ceremonial dances, and spiritual practices that tied the living to their ancestors. They were forbidden to gather freely, but on Sundays, in what became known as Congo Square, they were permitted to dance, drum, and sing. These gatherings blended African traditions with the influences of Catholic saints, French songs, and Spanish melodies. The result was a cultural fusion unlike anything the colonists had seen. Carnival seeped into Congo Square, and Congo Square seeped into Carnival. Masks took on new meaning, no longer just European symbols of anonymity, but African symbols of spirit and transformation. The line between celebration and ceremony blurred. What began as a French holiday started absorbing the heartbeat of a people who had survived the unthinkable. Mardi Gras became not only an indulgence before Lent, but a moment of freedom, a reclamation of identity. A day when the world's hierarchies loosened and the soul could breathe. This blending terrified the colonial rulers. They feared uprisings, communication through drums, gatherings that slipped beyond their control. So, they issued more bans against nighttime dancing, against masking, against gatherings that grew too large. The more they tried to suppress carnival, the stronger it grew. People will always fight hardest for the rituals that remind them they are human. By the mid-1700s, New Orleans shifted again. The Spanish took control following the 7 Years' War. They brought stricter laws, different architecture, new ideas of order. Fires tore through the city in 1788 and again in 1794, reshaping the quarter into the Spanish style still recognizable today. Through all of this upheaval, wars, fires, epidemics, carnival persisted. It threaded itself through each new regime, refusing to die even when the buildings burned. Under Spanish rule, Mardi Gras became more subdued. Public masking was banned outright. Street revelry was considered indecent. The Spanish favored quiet processions, pious observances, and controlled gatherings. But New Orleanians, Creoles, Africans, French settlers, free people of color, kept Carnival alive in their homes, their courtyards, their music. What could not be shouted in the streets was whispered in parlors and danced in back rooms. Even in silence, Carnival held its breath, waiting for its moment to return. That moment came with the American takeover in 1803. The Louisiana Purchase brought a new flag, new laws, and new tensions. The Americans and the Creoles clashed constantly. The Americans saw Mardi Gras as sinful chaos. The Creoles saw it as heritage. The Americans wanted order. The Creoles wanted memory. The Americans wanted a civilized city. The Creoles understood that New Orleans would never bend to northern sensibilities. Out of that tension, Mardi Gras changed again. The early 1800s saw a New Orleans teeming with sailors, merchants, gamblers, immigrants, enslaved people, and free people of color, all living in a cultural pressure cooker. Carnival season became a time when these tensions erupted, sometimes joyfully, sometimes violently. Masked riders thundered through the streets, firing pistols into the air. Revelers poured out of taverns shouting French and Creole songs. The wealthy held grand balls. The poor held rowdy street parties. The Americans watched with horror as the city surrendered itself to a ritual they could not control or fully understand. Disorder grew. Crime surged. Carnival threatened to tear the city apart instead of uniting it. Something had to change, not to kill Mardi Gras, but to save it. That salvation came from the most unexpected place: secrecy. In 1837, the first of the great krewes emerged, but silently. These were not public organizations then. They were cloaked fraternities, private societies formed by Creole elites to take back control of Carnival and reshape it into something respectable, artistic, and enduring. They met behind locked doors, chose themes and costumes, planned processions with military precision. They reclaimed Carnival from drunken street mobs and gave birth to the first organized ceremonial parades. Their names, Comus, Momus, later Proteus, carried mythic weight. Their members swore oaths of secrecy. Their rituals were half social, half mystical. This was the moment Mardi Gras became New Orleans' heartbeat, not just a celebration, but a tradition forged from survival, pride, and resistance. The masks returned, no longer signs of danger, but symbols of artistry and transformation. The parades marched, no longer chaotic, but orchestrated spectacles filled with meaning, satire, and beauty. Carnival season blossomed no longer a night of indulgence, but weeks of rituals leading to a shining, thunderous finale. On Mardi Gras Day, the city had shaped the celebration, and the celebration had shaped the city. They were bound now, inseparable. Looking back at the long road from that quiet 1,699 campfire on the riverbank to the grand masked parades of the 1800s, one truth becomes clear. Mardi Gras survived because the people who carried it refused to let anyone take it away. It adapted, it hid, it rose again. Every culture that touched New Orleans left its fingerprints on Carnival, and every challenge that threatened it only made it stronger. This is why, even today, the festival feels alive. It remembers the cold nights on the riverbank. It remembers the drums of Congo Square. It remembers the bands, the fires, the colonial orders meant to smother it. Mardi Gras is not just celebration, it is defiance wrapped in color. And in New Orleans, defiance is a form of prayer. There comes a point in every Southern tradition where it either dies under pressure or learns how to hide itself long enough to survive. Mardi Gras reached that point in the middle of the 1800s, when New Orleans was a city divided against itself, American on one side, Creole on the other. The French Quarter clinging to memory while the upriver districts filled with newcomers who didn't understand a bit of it. The city's identity was splitting like old wood under a hammer, and Carnival sat right at the fault line, too wild for the Americans, too sacred for the Creoles, too beloved to abandon, too chaotic to continue unchanged. If something didn't shift, the festival would burn itself out. It didn't have the chance, because before Mardi Gras could collapse, the city found a strange salvation in the place no one expected. A closed room, a locked door, a group of men gathered around a table, lit by a single oil lamp, and a decision that would alter the next 2 centuries of carnival. That night gave birth to something New Orleans had never seen before. Ritual dressed as organization, tradition guarded by 2. Secrecy, spectacle engineered with the precision of military strategy. That night gave birth to the first krewe. Now, it's important to understand what the city looked like leading up to this moment. The 1,830 seconds were feverish years. New Orleans had exploded into a booming port, one of the wealthiest in America. Steamboats lined the river like floating hotels. Cotton and sugar flowed through warehouses that stretched along the levee. Immigrants poured in from Ireland, Germany, the Caribbean, and South America. The Americans built mansions on the upriver side. The Creoles held onto the quarter as tightly as a rosary. Neither side trusted the other. The city was rich, proud, growing, and boiling with resentment. Mardi Gras reflected all of it. The celebration had become a battleground instead of a unifying ritual. Masked riders galloped through the streets, firing pistols. Street brawls broke out without warning. Drunken revelers smashed windows, overturned carts, and chased each other down muddy roads in costumes sewn together hours before the sun went down. The festival teetered each year between joy and riot, and the city leaders, American and Creole alike, worried they were witnessing the unraveling of something too old to lose. It was during one of these troubled seasons that a group of men, mostly Creole-born, many from old families, some educated in Europe, met quietly under gas lamps and shuttered windows. Their goal was not to extinguish Mardi Gras, but to reclaim it. They wanted to save the spirit of carnival by changing its shape. They believed the only way to preserve the celebration was to place it into the hands of those who cared enough to protect it. Those men called themselves Comus. They borrowed their name from John Milton's masque, Comus, a tale about revelry, temptation, and the fine edge between chaos and ceremony. It was the perfect emblem for what they intended. Comus would not simply parade. Comus would create a new kind of Mardi Gras, structured, mythic, artistic, mysterious. They produced the first nighttime procession of its kind in 1857, and the city never looked at Mardi Gras the same way again. Imagine that first Comus parade in the quiet streets of a gaslit city. Torches flickering against balconies, shadowed figures in elaborate costumes, faces hidden behind masks with hollow eyes, floats crude by modern standards, but wondrous to those who had never seen anything of the sort, creaked slowly through the streets. Spectators pressed close, stunned into silence. This was not drunken revelry. This was ceremony. This was spectacle. This was order cloaked in mystery. That night, Comus did more than parade. It set a precedent. Mardi Gras could be artistic. It could be disciplined. It could be beautiful and dangerous all at once. The festival no longer required chaos to breathe. It needed imagination. It needed structure. It needed guardians willing to protect the rituals behind the scenes while presenting something transcendent on the streets. From that moment on, krewes became the keepers of carnival, and secrecy became their shield. In New Orleans, secrecy has always been a language all its own. It holds power, protects legacy, and allows tradition to evolve without interference. For the krewes, secrecy meant guaranteeing that Mardi Gras remained untouched by politics, unclaimed by outsiders, and unbroken by the city's constant shifts in power. They created their own rules, their own hierarchies, their own myths. Membership was invitation only. Rituals were unwritten but unchangeable. Names of members were guarded like the city's most delicate treasure. To the average citizen, the krewes appeared once a year, rolling through the streets in masks and elegance, and then vanished again like spirits returning to sleep. That was the magic of it. Mardi Gras became something larger than anyone could see in daylight. More krewes followed. Comus in 1872, Proteus in 1882. Each krewe had its own aesthetic, its own temperament. Comus favored classical themes and mythical imagery, rich with Greek and Roman symbolism. Comus leaned toward satire, lampooning politics and society through sharp-edged humor. Proteus carried an air of the mysterious, its parades filled with references to nature, legend, and the supernatural. These krewes shaped Mardi Gras into a forest of stories, each float a chapter, each costume a sentence, each mask a word spoken without sound. But even with Comus and its successors, Carnival needed one more spark to become the celebration known today. That spark arrived in 1872, carried into the city by a visitor whose arrival turned Mardi Gras into a royal affair. The Russian Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich came to New Orleans during his tour of the United States. The city saw his visit as an opportunity to impress the world. Businessmen and Cree members gathered in hurried meetings. They created a new Cree in his honor, Rex, the king of Carnival. It was Rex who chose the official Mardi Gras colors: purple for justice, green for faith, gold for power. It was Rex who turned Mardi Gras into a civic holiday. It was Rex who gave the festival its regal identity. With Rex, Carnival gained a crown, a face, and a purpose. But while the parades dazzled the public, the deeper truth of Mardi Gras remained hidden behind krewe doors. Carnival was no longer merely a celebration, it was a coded language woven into the city's bones. Every float theme, every costume design, every bit of symbolism carried a message, understood by those who had studied the festival's lineage. The power of Mardi Gras lay not in what the crowd saw, but in what they didn't. That secrecy protected Carnival through war, disease, and political upheaval. During the Civil War, the city's occupation threatened Mardi Gras entirely. Union forces marched through the streets in blue coats, enforcing curfews and confiscating property. Businesses closed, churches filled, with prayers for peace. The city held its breath. But Comus refused to let Carnival die. In 1866, the crew paraded again for the first time since the war began, sending a message louder than any cannon. The spirit of New Orleans would endure. During yellow fever epidemics, when the air itself smelled of death and families lived behind shuttered windows, Carnival paused out of respect but never surrendered. And when the fever broke, the parades returned with renewed force color against a city starved for hope. In the late 1800s, the tensions between Creole and American neighborhoods still simmered, but Mardi Gras gave them a common language. On parade nights, wealthy Americans and Creole families stood shoulder to shoulder along Street Charles Avenue, watching the floats roll past. Even if they disagreed on nearly everything else, they could agree on Carnival. This unity didn't erase the city's divisions, but it created a place where those divisions had to sit quietly for a few hours. That was the secret power of Mardi Gras. It could make enemies share a moment, make strangers share a smile, make a city remember itself. Behind all this beauty, however, there was always a darker truth. Mardi Gras was born from the people's desire to be seen, and their fear of being seen too clearly. The mask symbolized freedom, but it also symbolized the vulnerability that came with living in a city always at risk of drowning, burning, or breaking. And so, secrecy became the backbone of Carnival. To reveal the sacred workings of the krewes was to weaken the ritual. To expose their identities was to strip Mardi Gras of its magic. For generations, families guarded krewe membership like an heirloom. Children grew up hearing whispers about which adults lived behind the masks. Floats weren't just built, they were conjured behind closed doors in workshops no outsider could enter without invitation. Parade themes were chosen a year in advance and kept secret until the floats emerged on the streets. Mardi Gras became the city's diary, open enough to read, guarded enough to keep the most intimate truths tucked between the lines. As the 19th century closed, New Orleans had transformed Mardi Gras from a wild colonial ritual into a carefully orchestrated celebration, woven with mythology, secrecy, and pride. The krewes had tamed the chaos without killing the spirit, but this didn't mean the festival had lost its edge. Beneath the silk costumes and torchlit parades, Carnival still carried all the danger and desire that first arrived with d'Iberville on that muddy riverbank. The difference was that its fire now burned in a controlled hearth. And that is how Mardi Gras survived the century. By balancing on the knife edge between order and rebellion, and by trusting its secrets to men and women who understood that the festival's power lay in what the world was allowed to see and what it wasn't. There's a truth about New Orleans that outsiders never quite grasp. This city doesn't move forward in a straight line. It moves in circles, cycles of feast and famine, fire and rebirth, joy and mourning, all turning around the same old axis like a spinning coin that never falls flat. Mardi Gras became the symbol of that rhythm, the living heartbeat that carried New Orleans through every disaster, scandal, and shift in power as the 19th century bled into the 20th. No matter what came, yellow fever, civil war, Reconstruction, political corruption, racial tension, hurricanes, the celebration found a way to rise from the rubble, shimmering like a jewel shaken loose from a cracked crown. By the early 1900s, Mardi Gras had already become the most recognizable ritual in the city, but its character was changing again. The Creole elites who had shaped the early krewes still held power, but they were no longer alone in the story. A new force was rising in New Orleans, a force born not from secrecy or old French families, but from the streets music. The kind of music that crawled out of Congo Square, slipped through back alleys, danced along Bourbon Street, and burst into the world as something no nation had ever heard before. Jazz. Jazz wasn't born in a ballroom. It wasn't created by those invited to the crew balls or welcomed into the misty circles of Comus or Momus. It grew in crowded rooms where the walls sweated with heat, where trumpets shouted over the clang of glasses, where drummers stitched rhythms older than the city itself. It was messy, vibrant, unpredictable, the opposite of the carefully choreographed parade floats designed in guarded workshops. Yet that is exactly why it belonged to Mardi Gras. The festival had always been a tug-of-war between order and chaos, refinement and rebellion, and jazz arrived as the perfect companion to that struggle. Street musicians began weaving themselves into carnival, following parades, warming up the crowds, filling the gaps between floats with rhythms that felt alive. What had been a mostly silent or brass band festival became something electric. The music lifted the street celebrations into something ecstatic. It ignited the neighborhoods beyond street, Charles Avenue, the Treme, the Marigny, the Bywater. Places where Mardi Gras had always lived in a raw, untamed form, suddenly found themselves connected to the larger tapestry of the celebration. The city's Creole community, with its rich history of European, Caribbean, and African ancestry, carried this musical explosion forward. They didn't always have the resources to build floats or rent ballrooms, but they had the one thing that no crew could manufacture: soul. Their Mardi Gras was street-born, colored feathers, sharp drum patterns, bold calls and responses that echoed down Claiborne Avenue. This energy birthed traditions that today stand as pillars of New Orleans culture, none more powerful than the Mardi Gras Indians. If the old Crees formed the secret society behind Carnival, the Mardi Gras Indians formed the spirit. Dressed in elaborate hand-sewn suits adorned with beads, feathers, sequins, and patches telling ancestral stories, the Mardi Gras Indians marched through the streets long before dawn. Their chants, two-way, pocky-way, and Indian red, carried histories that ran deeper than the city's written records. These were people whose families had lived under the shadow of poverty and racial oppression for generations. Yet every Mardi Gras, they rose like kings and queens. Their suits took months to make, each stitch a prayer, each feather a declaration that their identity could not be erased. The Crews had secrecy, the Indians had rebellion. Mardi Gras had room for both. As the century turned, the festival expanded in ways no one predicted. Torchbearers called flambeaux lit the nighttime parades with long poles of blazing fire. Their shadows leapt against the buildings as they moved, turning the streets into a flickering stage, where myth and mortality danced side by side. The parade crowds threw coins to the flambeau carriers, clapping and shouting as the men performed daring spins and flourishes, the fire painting halos in the night. The tradition began in the days before electric lights. But even after the arrival of modern lamps, the flambeau remained. Carnival wasn't interested in convenience. It embraced memory, even when memory carried the smoke of old dangers. The crew balls continued to grow more elaborate, invitations printed on silk, ladies in gowns imported from Paris, masked kings and queens chosen in secret, themes drawn from mythology, literature, and history. To attend a ball was to step into a dream built over centuries. But these balls remained closed to many black citizens, working-class families, immigrants, women without social connections, and anyone who didn't belong to the old families. Mardi Gras belonged to everyone, yet parts of it remained off-limits. That tension simmered quietly, preparing for a reckoning that would arrive decades later. In the early 1900s, New Orleans found itself facing new enemies: modernization, prohibition, and a country that often looked down its nose at the city's permissiveness. But Mardi Gras persisted, fueled by a stubborn pride. Even prohibition couldn't smother it. If anything, the celebration grew wilder. Masked revelers carried flasks tucked into garters, pockets, and boots. Speakeasies flourished. Crews crafted floats mocking federal agents. Music spilled out of shuttered windows, and New Orleans refined its identity as a place where the rules of the rest of the world were suspended at the city limits. Mardi Gras had grown from a survival ritual into something larger, the soul of New Orleans. But as with every good Southern story, darkness wasn't far behind. The early 20th century brought devastating outbreaks of yellow fever, hurricanes that tore through the Gulf Coast, and the Great Depression that left thousands hungry and jobless. Yet even in these years of suffering, Mardi Gras acted as a lifeline. People needed joy, the way a drowning man needs air. They needed ritual. They needed proof that the city would survive, no matter how hard the world shook it. Carnival season offered that proof. Families who couldn't afford to attend Cree balls stood along the parade routes, cheering as floats rolled past with kings waving jeweled scepters. Children sat on ladders, reaching for beads thrown from masked riders. Musicians played on corners for coins, turning sorrow into rhythm. The poor celebrated beside the wealthy, the sick beside the strong, the hopeful beside the hopeless. Mardi Gras was the one day when the city's wounds were bandaged with color. By mid-century, New Orleans had become a mosaic of cultures: Creole, Cajun, African, Caribbean, French, Spanish, Sicilian, Irish, and American, and Mardi Gras evolved to reflect that complexity. The old krewes still guarded their traditions, but new krewes emerged as the city grew. Some were formed by working-class neighborhoods, some by black organizations, some by women. Each one added a new voice to a festival that had begun as a small colonial ritual and now stretched across weeks, across communities, across every street of the city. The tension between the traditional krewes and the new ones, between secrecy and openness, between privilege and accessibility, mirrored the nation's growing civil rights struggles. New Orleans faced pressure to confront its segregated practices, and Mardi Gras felt that pressure too. The oldest krewes refused to integrate, choosing instead to withdraw from public parading rather than open their membership. But new krewes formed in their place, open, inclusive, diverse. Carnival changed yet again, and with it, New Orleans changed. It's a rare thing for a tradition to evolve without losing its soul, but Mardi Gras managed it. The city learned that tradition isn't a museum piece, it's a living thing, and living things grow. If they don't, they die. Through the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, Mardi Gras became louder, brighter, more democratic. The parades expanded. The floats grew larger and more theatrical. Marching bands from black high schools stunned the crowds with rolling drums, sharp choreography, and brassy crescendos that rattled the windows of homes along Street Charles Avenue. The Mardi Gras Indians continued to march, their suits bigger and more dazzling with each passing year, turning neighborhood parades into spiritual ceremonies. Tourists flooded the city, cameras in hand, eager to witness the magic that had become a part of America's cultural memory. But the truth behind Mardi Gras, the real truth, remained rooted in the parts of the celebration that outsiders never fully understood. Because Mardi Gras isn't the parades, it isn't the beads, it isn't the masks or the balls or the costumes. It's the way New Orleans refuses to let anything, not war, not disease, not poverty, not prejudice, steal its joy. Joy here is not frivolous, it is armor, it is rebellion. It is faith in a city that has been knocked down more times than any other place in America, and nothing carries that spirit more fiercely than Mardi Gras. By the time the century's storms rolled through Hurricane Betsy in 1965, Camille in 1969, the city had learned a hard lesson. Mardi Gras wasn't optional, it was essential. When the Gulf sent destruction, Mardi Gras repaired the soul. When the waters rose, Carnival lifted the heart. The celebration became a defiant shout into the wind. We're still here. We're still alive. We will not be broken. Every parade, every dance, every chant, every masked step down those old streets was a reminder that this city, this beautiful, battered, miraculous city, had a spine made of brass. And as the world changed, Mardi Gras carried its heritage forward. The secrets remained. The music swelled. The costumes glittered. The rituals deepened, all while the city marched through the storms of the new century, carrying with it a festival that had grown from a lonely night on the Mississippi riverbank into one of the most powerful cultural traditions in the world. Mardi Gras didn't just survive, it conquered. It became the living proof that no matter how hard the world tries to tame New Orleans, the city will always choose celebration over surrender. And the masks worn each carnival season, they are not disguises, they are declarations. Declarations that the truth of Mardi Gras, the real truth, is rooted in defiance, pride, memory, and a joy deep enough to outlast every storm. By the mid-20th century, Mardi Gras had grown into a world of its own, a universe built from old secrets, new music, ancient rhythms, and ceremonies that stitched together centuries of cultures. But even a festival with magic woven into its bones could not escape the greatest upheaval the South would face. The battle for equality, dignity, and the right to exist without chains, laws, or shadows holding a person down. Mardi Gras had long promised, even if only for a moment, a world turned upside down. But when the real world outside the parades caught fire with protest and change, the city was forced to confront the truth that had sat quietly under the masks for generations. New Orleans had always lived with two faces, one smiling in the parades, and one carrying the weight of the past through the rest of the year. It was a city built on contradictions. Creole salons steeped in French refinement, standing only blocks away from shotgun houses, where families worked themselves sick to survive. Krewes dripping with silk and jewels parading through neighborhoods where children leaned on ladders that wobbled with every passing float. Women sewing gowns for balls they'd never be allowed to attend. Men crafting floats out of paper and wire just to watch them roll past mansions where their names were never spoken. Mardi Gras united the city in spectacle, but not in equality. As the civil rights movement swept across the nation, that contradiction grew louder. The krewes, those old, powerful secret societies that had shaped Mardi Gras since the 1800s, refused to integrate. They had built their traditions on lineage, exclusivity, and secrecy. And for them, opening the doors was unthinkable. Membership was passed father to son, carried like a relic, and guarded with a fierce devotion that bordered on reverence. When the city government passed an ordinance requiring organizations to certify that they did not discriminate, the oldest krewes did not bend. They bowed out. Comus, founded in 1872, withdrew from public parading. Comus, the oldest of them all, vanished from the streets. Proteus retreated as well, only to slowly return decades later. They chose absence over change. To outsiders, this looked like the mighty crumbling. To New Orleans, it felt like a wound, deep, inevitable, and long delayed. But the truth is this: Mardi Gras didn't weaken in that moment, it evolved. The celebration had never belonged to just one group, one race, one class, or one tradition. It had always been the child of many, and once the old guard stepped aside, space opened for something else, something truer to the spirit of New Orleans. The new krewes that emerged weren't bound by century-old rules or hiding behind veils of secrecy rooted in exclusivity. They welcomed the people who had always shaped the city from the ground up: black families, immigrant families, working-class neighborhoods, women who had fought for their place at the table long before the table ever recognized them. These krewes marched not because they had inherited the right, but because they had earned it. Crewe of Zulu, founded by black laborers in 1909, stepped forward with a power that had been growing quietly in the city's bones for generations. For years, Zulu had paraded on its own, terms mocking the pomp of Rex with grass skirts, coconut throws, and a satirical crown representing the pride and resilience of a community that had endured its culture being dismissed or stolen. Now Zulu took its rightful place at the front of Carnival, not in the shadows. The Young Men, Olympian Jr., Benevolent Association, the Baby Dolls, the Skull and Bone Gangs, the Sixth Ward Social Aid and Pleasure Clubs, and the Mardi Gras Indians, each in their own way, carried forward the soul of a people whose celebrations had been marginalized for decades. Their traditions were older than the parades sanctioned by the city, older than Rex, older than most of the krewes that had refused integration. These were not just groups. They were living histories, rituals of survival disguised as celebration. The baby dolls, born in the early 1900s from the black sex workers and domestic laborers of Storyville, marched through the streets in feathered masks and bright dresses, reclaiming joy through a world that had denied them dignity. Their legacy carried on through daughters and granddaughters who learned the steps the same way others learned hymns. The Skull and Bone gangs emerged before sunrise each Mardi Gras morning, waking the neighborhood with chants of, "You next." Their skeletal costumes and bone masks weren't crafted for fear, they were reminders that death walks beside every person, and the only answer to mortality is to live boldly while breath remains. And in the back streets of the Treme and the 7th Ward, the Mardi Gras Indians sharpened their needles and began stitching their suits, bright feathered crowns rising like suns, beadwork glimmering in patterns that carried memories from across oceans. Their tribes weren't just groups of men, they were living connections to ancestors who had survived against impossible odds. When the chiefs met on Mardi Gras morning, the air between them shimmered with something older than English, older than French, older than New Orleans itself. The city was changing, and Carnival changed with it. The parades grew larger, the music louder, the crowds thicker. Streetcars, a long street, Charles rattled with children wearing cheap plastic crowns. Uptown families built ladders with painted seats for their kids to sit above the crowds. Neighborhood krewes threw doubloons into outstretched hands, round coins that glinted gold in the sunlight like tiny pieces of captured fire. High school marching bands thundered down the boulevard, their drums shaking the ground. The floats stretched longer, taller, brighter. Carnival had become a spectacle fit for the world's stage. But even in this modern age, the old magic didn't die. It simply found new places to hide. Behind the floats and costumes, in the quiet hours before dawn, New Orleans still held on to the rituals that outsiders seldom witness. It was in the sewing rooms where women stitched beads onto swaths of velvet. It was in the kitchens where families baked king cakes, hiding plastic babies beneath spirals of sugar. It was in the back doors of bars where musicians practiced late into the night, horns and strings echoing off old brick walls. It was in the whispered prayers of mothers who hoped their children would come home safe after the celebrations ended. Mardi Gras was spectacle, but it was also community, memory, and devotion. The century pressed forward, and the city weathered more storms, the kind that destroyed homes, the kind that shattered industries, the kind that tore at the soul. Yet every time, Mardi Gras served as the proof that New Orleans would not be swallowed by despair. Nothing demonstrated that better than the aftermath of Hurricane Betsy in 1965. Betsy smashed into Louisiana with winds that ripped rooftops from homes and drove water into neighborhoods like a drowning hand. The lower 9th Ward suffered catastrophically. Families were displaced. The dead were pulled from floodwaters. For many places, a disaster of that scale would have extinguished celebrations for years, but New Orleans held fast to its oldest truth. If the body is wounded, the spirit must be fed. The city rebuilt, and when carnival season returned, parades rolled again. They weren't perfect. Some krewes marched with half-finished floats. Some bands arrived in borrowed uniforms. Some families were still living with neighbors, their homes gutted to the studs. But Mardi Gras came because it had to. It always had to. The people needed it the way a lantern needs oil. The festival was changing yet again, moving beyond the rigid lines of old social divisions. Women formed their own krewes, Iris leading the way. Neighborhood krewes emerged, energized by local pride. LGBTQ+ communities found their place, most famously in the dazzling, hilarious, and brilliantly satirical krewe of Petronius, founded in 1961. Carnival had always held room for anyone willing to dance in the streets, but now it claimed that inclusiveness openly. And, through all of this, New Orleans carried the weight of history with a kind of grace only this city can muster. It didn't erase the scars from the past, but it turned them into lacework beautiful, complicated, impossible to untangle. Mardi Gras became the mirror through which the city saw both its wounds and its triumphs. By the time the 1,970 seconds arrived, Carnival had become a living museum of the city's soul. The parades were larger than ever. Television stations broadcast the events across the country. Tourists poured into the French Quarter each year like tidewater. Hotels booked months in advance. Beads and doubloons flooded the streets. College students arrived in bright shirts and wild costumes. Mardi Gras had begun to resemble the modern festival known today, spectacular, loud, colorful, unrestrained. But beneath the lights and glitter, the truth remained the same. Mardi Gras was never just a party. It was identity. It was rebellion. It was heritage kept alive by a city that refuses to die. And the masks worn each year, they weren't just costumes. They were reminders, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, that joy can be armor, that memory can be power, and that New Orleans will always find a way to dance, even when the world tries to quiet the music. Mardi Gras survived the century the same way New Orleans has survived every century, by bending, never breaking, by absorbing pain and turning it into rhythm, by holding the line between sorrow and celebration and daring to march straight down the middle. It is not a festival built from wealth or politics. It is a festival built from people, every kind of people breathing the same air, standing shoulder to shoulder under strings of beads and strands of light, choosing joy together. And that choice, year after year, is what keeps the city alive. There are cities that crumble when disaster strikes, cities whose stories end when the storm arrives, whose foundations crack beneath the weight of tragedy. And then there's New Orleans, a place carved from mud and miracles, held up not by stone or steel, but by stubborn faith and the unshakable belief that even the darkest nights deserve a parade come morning. As the 20th century deepened and the modern age unfurled like a long, uncertain road, Mardi Gras found itself tested in ways older generations could never have imagined. Yet test after test, trial after trial, the festival endured. It adapted, it strengthened, it grew into the heartbeat of a city fighting to stay alive. By the 1,970 Mardi Gras had become an international spectacle. Television broadcasts carried the parades to living rooms across America. Magazines printed glossy photos of masked riders tossing beads into crowds as thick as river fog. The French Quarter burst at the seams every year, filled with tourists who came seeking the wildness they had heard about in rumors and travel guides. But fame brought new pressures. Politicians argued about the future of Carnival. Cultural leaders feared the festival's soul would be drowned in neon signs and souvenir shops. The outsiders saw Mardi Gras as a party. The locals knew it was a prayer. Still, even with the influx of attention, the old ways held strong. The krewes guarded their rituals like family heirlooms. The Mardi Gras Indians stitched their suits with patience and pride. The baby dolls danced through the streets, carrying forward a tradition built from resilience. The skull and bone gangs woke their neighborhoods before dawn with skeletal masks and rattling staffs, reminding the living to respect the thin line between this world and the next. And every year, under all the noise, all the music, all the color, the same old truth pulsed quietly beneath it. Mardi Gras was not something the city performed. It was something the city became. But the world outside New Orleans was shifting rapidly. The oil crisis hit the Gulf Coast. Crime rates rose. The city struggled with poverty, corruption, and the tension between modernization and heritage. Through it all, the one constant was Carnival. It didn't matter how lean the year had been or how hard the times. The parades rolled. The flambeaux flickered against the night sky. Marching bands thundered down Street Charles Avenue, their snares cutting through the air like lightning. The city might struggle 11 months of the year, but during Carnival, it remembered its strength. Still, the greatest test had not yet arrived. That test came in the form of a storm so powerful, so merciless, that even the oldest New Orleanians, those who had lived through Betsy and Camille and countless lesser hurricanes, felt a cold fear settle in their bones. The city had always been vulnerable, built below sea level, held together by levees and good fortune. New Orleans existed on the promise that the river and the Gulf would behave themselves long enough for families to grow, music to flourish, and traditions to take root. But nature doesn't honor promises, it keeps receipts. In late August of 2005, as Hurricane Katrina roared toward the coast, the people of New Orleans did what they had always done, prepared, prayed, hoped. Some fled early, some stayed behind, believing past experience would carry them through. Some had nowhere to go at all. When the storm hit, the wind tore at roofs and ripped apart homes. But it was not the wind that broke the city's heart. It was the water. When the levees failed, the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain poured into the neighborhoods like a nightmare come to life. The lower Ninth Ward was swallowed in minutes. The floodwaters rose in Gentilly, Mid-City, Lakeview, New Orleans East. Entire blocks vanished under a gray, swirling sea. Families climbed into attics. Some hacked their way through roofs with axes. Others drifted on makeshift rafts, staring at a city drowned in silence. The storm took lives, homes, stories, memories. It scarred the city in a way no festival could ever fully heal. For a time, it seemed as though the heartbeat of New Orleans had gone still. The streets were empty. The music was quiet. The parades were a distant memory. The city was broken, soaked through with grief, and uncertain whether the world it had known would ever return. But Mardi Gras is woven into New Orleans in a way even storms cannot unweave. And so, in the months following Katrina, as the mud dried and the debris was cleared, a question rose from the despair like a lantern struggling to stay lit. Would Mardi Gras happen? Some argued that it was impossible, that the city was too wounded, too shattered. Others said it would be disrespectful to celebrate while so many homes lay in ruins. But the elders of the city, the ones who had watched Mardi Gras carry New Orleans through centuries of hardship, knew the truth that outsiders could not see. Carnival wasn't a celebration. It was a declaration that the city still lived. And so, in February of 2006, with debris still piled on, sidewalks and blue tarps covering roofs like an improvised patchwork quilt, Mardi Gras returned. The crowds were thinner, the parades smaller. Some floats were unfinished, their paint rushed, their decorations improvised, but they rolled. And as they rolled down wind-swept avenues lined with ruined homes, people stood on ladders and porches and sidewalks, tears mixing with laughter as beads flew through the air. Those parades were not about spectacle, they were about survival. Each float was a promise that New Orleans would not surrender. Each marching band was a heartbeat. Each mask was a reminder that joy can exist even in mourning. And when the flambeaux carried their torches through the ruined streets, their flames cast long shadows that looked like the city's ancestors walking beside them, whispering that resilience is the oldest ritual of all. Mardi Gras, after Katrina, became a symbol so powerful that it reshaped the city's identity. It proved that New Orleans was not defined by its tragedies, but by its ability to rise through them. The world watched a city that had been dismissed as lost show a strength that couldn't be measured in levee height or federal funding. Carnival became the testament that culture can endure where infrastructure fails. The celebration didn't ignore the storm, it answered it. As the years passed, New Orleans rebuilt itself piece by piece. New krewes formed, more diverse, more inclusive, more reflective of the city's many voices. Neighborhood krewes brought carnival back to the blocks where families had lived for generations. Social clubs revived traditions nearly lost to the floodwaters. Mardi Gras Indians marched with suits brighter than ever, wearing the history of their people in every feather and bead. And in the midst of this rebirth, Mardi Gras entered a new era, one where the festival no longer belonged solely to the city's past, but to its future. The 2010 seconds saw the rise of krewes that broke every rule the old guard had held sacred. Krewe of Chewbacca's, a sci-fi parade of costumed rebels rolling through the Marigny, proved that carnival had room for every imagination. Krewe of Nix, an all-female krewe, grew into one of the largest in the city, showing that carnival's queens could command as much reverence as its kings. Krewe du Vieux, rooted in satire and irreverence, marched through the quarter with biting commentary that honored a long Mardi Gras tradition, mocking power until power remembered its place. Through it all, the festival maintained its ancient heart, a ritual of transformation. Masks may change, but the reason for wearing them remains. A person behind a mask is not hidden, they're revealed, freed from judgment, freed from history, freed from the expectations the world piles on their shoulders. That moment of transformation, whether in a ballroom dripping with chandeliers or a side street where children dance beside makeshift floats, is the spark that keeps Mardi Gras alive. New Orleans learned something crucial in its modern age. Mardi Gras is not simply a reflection of the city. It is the engine that keeps the city's spirit burning. Without carnival, the city dries up like a forgotten well. With carnival, it becomes a river, wide, deep, unstoppable. As the world around New Orleans grew more digital, more hurried, more disconnected, Mardi Gras remained stubbornly physical, tactile, and human. Beads tossed from floats felt heavy in the hand. Doubloons clinked in pockets, feathers brushed against shoulders in crowded bars. The music rattled windows and shook the ground. The joy was not virtual, it was real. It was shared. It was alive. And that is the secret of Mardi Gras in the modern age. It reminds people that they belong to something bigger than themselves. Not a government, not a corporation, not a political movement, but a tradition carried forward by ancestors whose names are long forgotten, but whose footsteps still echo in the parades every year. Even now, Carnival reflects the same truth it did centuries ago. When French settlers prayed for survival on the Mississippi riverbank, when African rhythms rose in Congo Square, when Creole neighborhoods gathered in defiance, when secret krewes lit torches against the night, when jazz poured into the streets like holy water, that truth is simple, powerful, and unchanging. Joy is a form of resistance, ritual is a form of survival, and Mardi Gras is where New Orleans refuses to surrender. The modern era brought storms, crises, political battles, cultural clashes, and the transformation of a small colonial celebration into a global phenomenon. But it could not take away the essence of Carnival, for in New Orleans, Mardi Gras is not just celebrated, it is lived, it is endured, it is inherited, it is sacred, and as long as the city stands, no matter how many storms come, no matter how many levees break, no matter how many times the world doubts it, Mardi Gras will rise, dressed in feathers and sequins, carrying the laughter of generations, reminding the living that the soul of New Orleans is unbreakable. If you spend enough time in New Orleans, you come to understand something most outsiders never will. Mardi Gras isn't a festival built by hands, it's a festival built by spirits. Not ghosts in the Hollywood sense, not apparitions slipping through walls, but the spirits carried within people, families, cultures, and memories so old they feel like they were carved into the riverbed itself. The modern world looks at Mardi Gras and sees parades. The city looks at Mardi Gras and sees ancestry. That ancestry stands on every corner the moment carnival season begins. It breathes in the sound of a trumpet warming up before sunrise. It hangs in the scent of king cake cooling on a countertop. It echoes in the soft murmur of prayers whispered beneath masks. And above all else, it settles into the ritual of transformation, the ancient belief that a person becomes something truer when they step behind a mask. Because in New Orleans, a mask isn't a disguise, it's a doorway. To understand the spiritual side of Mardi Gras, you have to peel back the layers of history until you reach the earliest roots, long before parades rolled or crews formed. The French settlers carried with them the European idea of carnival as a sacred inversion of power, a time when the lowly could mock the mighty, when kings could become fools, and fools kings. These rituals were older than the church calendar itself. They reached back to Roman festivals of misrule and medieval feasts of fools, where society loosened its grip for one precious day. But when those rituals crossed the ocean and collided with the cultures already simmering in Louisiana, they changed, they deepened. They stretched themselves over new rhythms, new belief systems, new spiritual landscapes. The Africans brought in bondage, carried with them spiritual traditions that had survived the lash, survived ships, survived separation. Those traditions understood that the world of the living and the world of the spirits were not distant lands. They touched, overlapped, and flowed into each other like currents in the river. Masks, in many African cultures, were not decorations. They were sacred. They allowed the wearer to embody a spirit, an ancestor, a guardian. They allowed grief to be voiced, anger to be carried, strength to be borrowed. That belief survived inside Congo Square, hidden behind drum beats and dances that outsiders pretended not to understand. The native tribes who had lived along the lower Mississippi for centuries also understood the mask as a symbol of protection and spiritual passage. Their ceremonies honored the animals, the land, and the ancestors who watched from the other side of the veil. When French settlers traded with them or bribed them with trinkets, they saw masks adorned with feathers, shells, and patterns meant not for beauty but meaning. And then there were the Creoles, descendants of French and African, Spanish and Caribbean, indigenous and European bloodlines, whose cultural fusion became the backbone of New Orleans' identity. Their understanding of carnival was shaped not by one tradition but by many. To them, a mask was a chance to step outside of caste and category, a chance to exist without the labels colonial society tried to force upon them. Behind a mask, a Creole woman could mock the governor. Behind a mask, a poor man could dance beside aristocrats without fear. Behind a mask, a free person of color could move through spaces otherwise denied. All these traditions, beliefs, and histories braided themselves together over centuries. By the time the first official krewes formed in the 1800s, the spiritual foundation had already been laid. The krewes added pageantry and structure, but the soul of carnival, the parts people didn't talk about in polite company, came from the mixture of ancestral memory and spiritual instinct carried by the people who had lived through fire, flood, slavery, and survival. This spiritual side of Mardi Gras is not written on float banners or printed on parade maps. It passes through families in the quiet hours of dawn. It lingers in the way a mother ties a ribbon to her child's costume. It whispers through the needle of a Mardi Gras Indian as he stitches a pattern into his suit, a pattern his grandfather taught him, whose meaning was whispered by someone long before that. To truly know this part of carnival, you have to study the masks. There are masks of laughter, bright, golden things with curling smiles that flash in the street lamps like embers. They represent joy carried through hardship, the idea that laughter can become a weapon against despair. These masks remind the city that celebration isn't frivolous, it is necessary. Then, there are the masks of sorrow, painted in deep purples, greens, or blacks, with long lines that stretch like tears. These masks acknowledge the weight New Orleans carries. They are reminders that carnival does not erase grief. It simply walks beside it. There are the skeleton masks, the ones worn at dawn by the skull and bone gangs. Those bone-white faces with teeth etched in fierce grin are not frightening to the locals. They are reminders that life is fragile, and every moment is borrowed. When children wake to the sound of rattling staffs and clattering bones, they aren't being scared. They're being taught to respect the thin veil between this world and the next. There are the feathered masks of the Mardi Gras Indians, fierce faces framed in plumes and beadwork so intricate it seems impossible for human hands to create. These masks carry pride. They honor the native tribes who helped enslaved Africans escape into the swamps centuries earlier. They honor ancestors who endured, resisted, and created something beautiful from struggle. And then there are the simple masks, the plain satin ones, tied with thin ribbons, sold at corner shops or handed down through families. These masks are not about spectacle, they are about protection. In a city where memory can be a burden, a mask allows a person to let go of who they were if only for a night. That is the heart of Mardi Gras. Transformation. Transformation, not as escape, but as truth. People often misunderstand this. They think the wildness of Mardi Gras is an attempt to hide from reality. The opposite is true. Carnival allows people to confront parts of themselves they are afraid to face in daylight. It allows the powerful to play at foolishness, and the powerless to claim a moment of sovereignty. It allows grief to dance, desire to speak, and memory to be honored. This spiritual transformation is most visible on Mardi Gras morning, when the city wakes before dawn. The air is cool, heavy with fog. The streets are quiet except for the far-off rumble of drums. Somewhere in the Treme, a chief of a Mardi Gras Indian tribe stands in the dark, his suit towering around him like the rise of a brilliant sun. He breathes slowly. He prays. He waits for the moment the city awakens enough to receive him. When he steps into the street, feathers brushing the earth, it isn't a costume, it's a resurrection. When the skull and bone gangs appear in skeletal regalia, pounding staffs against the pavement, they aren't performing, they're reminding the city that life is sacred. That time is borrowed. That tomorrow is not promised. When the baby dolls dance in stockings and feathers, laughing through the streets, they aren't entertaining. They're carrying the defiant joy of women whose ancestors were denied femininity, denied safety, denied rest. Their movement is a rebellion passed from mother to daughter. And when Zulu rolls with coconut throws and grass skirts, the satire is more than comedy. It is reclamation, a declaration that dignity can be carved from what once was used to mock. Even the flambeaux, carriers, men holding torches whose flames ripple like molten gold, are not simply lighting the night. They are performing a ritual that stretches back to the time before electricity, before parades had sound systems or floodlights. Those torches carry echoes of ancient fire ceremonies, where flames were believed to guide spirits, protect travelers, and cleanse the path ahead. The spiritual core of Mardi Gras is everywhere if you know how to look. It lives in the moment the city kneels together for Ash Wednesday, the day after Carnival ends, as though it is exhaling all the weight it carried through the celebrations. It lives in the beads that hang from oak trees all year long, shimmering in summer heat like frozen music. It lives in the way families bury their dead wearing Mardi Gras colors, believing joy has a place even in grief. It lives in the way children paint masks in schools, not as art projects but as lessons in identity. For New Orleans, Mardi Gras is not about forgetting who you are. It is about remembering all the layers of who you are, all the histories, all the stories, all the scars, all the triumphs. A masked rider tossing beads is reenacting centuries of ritual generosity. A brass band marching is echoing rhythms carried across oceans. A parade rolling through uptown is moving along a path shaped by generations of celebration and struggle. A float lit by torchlight is carrying symbols older than the street beneath it, and beneath it all, beneath the feathers, the glitter, the sequins, the chants, the rum, the laughter, there is a truth. Mardi Gras has never been about spectacle. It has always been about spirit. The spirit of a city that has buried its dead on high ground for centuries. The spirit of people who learned to make music out of pain. The spirit of communities who stitched their identities from pieces the world threw away. The spirit of ancestors who whisper through masks, guiding the living. The spirit of resistance wrapped in beauty. Mardi Gras is alive because the people are alive, and the people are alive because Mardi Gras gives them a place to breathe. This is the spiritual heart of Carnival, the part not written on posters or televised on parade coverage. The magic that cannot be monetized, mapped, or measured. The truth that sits quietly behind every mask worn in the city, year after year. Because in New Orleans, masks do not hide. They reveal, they remember, they honor. And as long as there are people here to wear them, Mardi Gras will remain what it has always been. A celebration of the soul painted in color, stitched with memory, crowned with music, and built to outlast every storm that dares rise over the Gulf. There are places in this world where tradition fades like old paint, where time wears down culture until only fragments remain. But New Orleans is not one of those places. This city holds on to its rituals with a determination rivaled only by the river that hugs its shoulder. And nowhere is that determination felt more deeply, more fiercely, than in Mardi Gras, the celebration that has outlived wars, epidemics, fires, floods, and every disaster the Gulf has ever thrown at it. Mardi Gras is not a holiday that New Orleans celebrates. It is a force that New Orleans becomes. To understand what Mardi Gras really means, not the story told on postcards, not the spectacle visitors see for a weekend, but the truth, you have to stand at the edge of the Mississippi River at dawn the morning after Carnival ends. The wind is cool, almost tender, like the city is finally exhaling after holding its breath through weeks of revelry. The beads hang from oak trees, swaying gently in the early light. The sidewalks are littered with confetti that clings to the cracks like memories refusing to be swept away. The river moves slow, wide, knowing, as though it has witnessed every parade, every dance, every mask, every secret whispered beneath street lamps over 3 centuries. That river remembers everything. It remembers the French explorers who held the first humble Mardi Gras ceremony on a muddy bank in 1699, far from home, longing for comfort. It remembers the enslaved Africans who brought their drums and dances to Congo Square, infusing carnival with rhythms older than the land itself. It remembers the Creole families who stitched together a festival from French ritual, African spirituality, and Caribbean heat. It remembers the secret krewes who guarded the celebration through years when chaos threatened to tear it apart. It remembers the yellow fever epidemics, when masked parades paused but the spirit of carnival stayed smoldering beneath the grief. It remembers the jazz musicians who breathed new life into the festival, giving Mardi Gras a voice the world had never heard. It remembers the civil rights battles that reshaped the meaning of community, identity, and equality. It remembers the hurricanes that carved scars into the city but never managed to extinguish its joy. The river has carried the bones of New Orleans, and Mardi Gras has carried its soul. And if you listen closely to that river at dawn on Ash Wednesday, the first quiet day after Carnival, you can hear that soul humming beneath the surface, echoing through time. That is the moment when the city understands itself most clearly, when the costumes are folded away, when the masks are placed gently in drawers, when the last bead rolls into a storm drain, when the torches go dark and the brass bands have slept for the first time in days. It is in that stillness that the true meaning of Mardi Gras reveals itself. The world often looks at this city and wonders how it persists, how it keeps celebrating after hurricanes flatten homes, how it keeps singing after epidemics steal entire families, how it keeps dancing in a nation that often misunderstands or dismisses it, how it continues to rise despite poverty, corruption, violence, and the relentless erosion of time. The answer is simple, though rarely spoken aloud. Mardi Gras is the city's defiance made visible. It is New Orleans refusing to die. Where other cities build their identities on monuments or industries, New Orleans builds hers on ritual. Ritual passed from mother to child, from neighbor to neighbor, from one generation of revelers to the next. Ritual written in the cadence of drums, in the shimmer of feathers, in the heat of torches, in the breath of laughter that rises from a crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder along Street Charles Avenue. Ritual that tells the living, we are still here. Ritual that whispers to the dead, we remember. It is this memory living, breathing, humming that keeps Mardi Gras alive. The masks worn each carnival season are not meant to hide identities but to reveal the deeper truth of them. Behind a mask, a man might discover the courage he lacks in daylight. A woman might claim a power denied to her the rest of the year. A child might step into a story larger than anything written in books. The mask frees the spirit, loosens the binds of judgment, and reminds the city that identity is not fixed, it is fluid, shifting, evolving, like the river. The parades, magnificent as they are merely the surface. Their real meaning lies beneath. Each float is a page in a book that began writing itself centuries ago. The kings and queens crowned each year are not rulers but symbols, living reminders that New Orleans has always crowned joy, never sorrow. The flambeau carriers lighting the night are echoes of ancient fire rituals meant to protect the living. The doubloons tossed into outstretched hands carry the legacy of generosity born from hardship, and the music that spills from streets and windows and porches during Carnival is the heartbeat of a city that has suffered and loved more deeply than most places ever will. Jazz, brass bands, second-line rhythms, these sounds rise from grief and celebration, braided tightly together, inseparable. When the world tries to destroy New Orleans, the music is the first thing that pushes back. And then there is the spiritual side of Mardi Gras, the ancient energy that thrums through the city during Carnival season like a pulse beneath the skin. Even those who don't believe in spirits or saints or ancestral whispers find themselves moved by something they cannot name. It is the presence of the past. It is the echo of those who came before. It is the collective memory of a people who have endured everything and still dare to dance. This spiritual dimension is what separates Mardi Gras from every other festival on earth. It is not performative. It is not decorative. It is not artificial. It is a survival ritual, a ceremony of renewal that predates the city, predates the country, predates every flag that has ever flown over this land. When the Mardi Gras Indians meet before dawn in towering suits of feathers and beadwork, you can feel the ancestors in the air. When the baby dolls dance their defiant dance, you can feel the women who carried that tradition through a century of struggle. When the skull and bone gangs wake the neighborhoods with skeletal warnings, you can feel the reminder that life is precious. When Rex rolls down Canal Street in royal splendor, you can feel the weight of a city claiming its rebirth. These traditions are not empty. They are sacred, and sacred things do not die. That is why Mardi Gras endures. That is why New Orleans survives. Because Carnival is not a distraction from suffering, it is a confrontation with it. A declaration that even in the face of disaster, life continues. Joy continues. Community continues. The soul continues. When Katrina drowned the city, Mardi Gras returned to prove that hope floats. When the levees broke, Carnival reassembled the pieces of the city's spirit. When grief pressed its weight into the corners of every neighborhood, beads still flew from floats. When sorrow became a river, laughter became a bridge. In the modern day, when visitors fly from across the world to experience Mardi Gras, they think they are witnessing a celebration. What they are actually witnessing is resilience. What they are hearing in the brass bands is survival. What they are seeing in the dancers and the costumes and the flambeaux is a ritual of rebirth that no storm, no government, no tragedy can take away. Because Mardi Gras is not for show, it is for the soul. And the soul of New Orleans is larger than any one person, any one family, any one generation. Carnival is a tapestry woven from every life that has touched this place, the known and the unknown, the celebrated and the forgotten. Every mask worn, every bead thrown, every song played becomes part of that tapestry. And when the festivities finally reach their end, when the last parade turns off the avenue and the night settles in spent and satisfied, the city returns to its rituals of quiet. Ash. Wednesday dawns, churches fill, people line up to receive the mark of ashes on their foreheads, a reminder that life is fleeting, that time is precious, that the body is dust. But even in that solemn moment, the echoes of carnival remain, because Mardi Gras is not something that ends, it is something that returns, it is something that calls, it is something that remembers. And as long as the river flows, as long as the oak trees stand, as long as music rises from the streets and laughter warms the air, New Orleans will answer that call. The masks will be tied, the drums will beat, the krewes will roll, the city will shine, and the truth behind Mardi Gras, the truth carried through centuries of struggle and celebration, will continue to whisper through the streets. We are still here. We remember. We celebrate. We survive. And New Orleans, that ancient, defiant, beautiful city, will always rise to meet the dawn, with feathers on her shoulders, sequins in her hair, and a heartbeat brave enough to outlast the river.